The night Henry Bergstrom died was not remarkable by Montana standards. That is the part that stayed with Clara longest, not the grief, not the silence that followed, but the ordinariness of it, the way a catastrophic thing can arrive wearing the clothes of a Tuesday evening, looking exactly like every other Tuesday evening that came before it, giving no warning, offering no ceremony, simply stepping through the door the way death always does, quietly without knocking, while you are looking somewhere else. It was February 1869. The temperature outside the cabin walls had dropped to 30 below zero, which was cold but not unusual. Not the coldest week that winter, not even the coldest night. The kind of cold that Montana settlers had learned to live inside the way fish learn to live inside water. Not comfortably exactly, but with the dull acceptance of creatures who have no other choice. The cabin was good timber. Henry had built it himself the summer before with walls 2 feet thick and a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall. By American standards of that time and place, it was a solid home. The kind of home a man was proud of. The kind of home a man believed in. Clara believed in it too then. She was 32 years old that February, with silver already threading her dark hair at the temples, not from age, but from something her hands remembered, even when her mouth refused to speak of it. Those hands had kneaded bread in 3 different states, had sewn curtains for 4 different windows in 4 different towns, had learned and relearned the art of making a strange place feel like home. She was good at that. Henry used to say it was her greatest gift of the ability to walk into 4 bare walls and a dirt floor and have it smelling like a home within a week. What she could not do, what no amount of gift or determination could do, was make the cabin warm enough. She had tried everything. She chinked the gaps between the logs with moss and clay. She hung heavy wool blankets against the interior walls. She kept the fire burning from before dawn until well past midnight, feeding it steadily, watching the woodpile beside the door diminish with a quiet arithmetic that frightened her more than she admitted. The fire roared. The cabin breathed out heat, and the cold came through the walls anyway, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its way through stone, one molecule at a time, patient as geology, unstoppable as time. By the 3rd week of February, the woodpile was running low. Henry noticed before Clara said anything. He was that kind of man, the kind who woke early and worked late, who fixed the neighbor's fence without being asked who noticed the woodpile getting low before his wife had to mention it. He was not a hero. He was not a saint. He was simply a good man, the most common and the most underrated of all human categories. A man who understood that love is not a feeling but a practice, and who practiced it every day without calling attention to the practice. Their son Eli was 8 years old. He was asleep in the loft, buried under every quilt. Clara owned his breath, making small clouds in the air above his face, even inside the cabin, because the loft was always colder than the main room, and the main room was already cold enough to see your breath by 9 in the evening. Henry pulled on his coat. It was a good coat, wool and canvas with a sheepskin lining Clara had sewn in herself the previous winter. He buttoned it to the throat. He pulled on his hat, his gloves, his boots. He moved the way a man moves when he is doing an ordinary thing without drama, without ceremony, with the easy efficiency of someone who has done this same task 100 times before and expects to do it 100 times more. The woodshed was 20 feet from the cabin door. 20 feet, the length of a good-sized room. The distance a man can throw a stone without effort. The gap between 2 things that are by any reasonable measure right next to each other. Henry kissed Clara's forehead. He told her he would be right back. She remembered the specific warmth of his lips, the scratch of his beard, the smell of wood smoke already in his coat from the evening's fire. She went back to the pot of beans on the stove. The door closed behind him. Not a slam. A soft click, the latch catching the way it always caught the ordinary sound of a man leaving his house to do an ordinary thing. Clara waited for the sound of his boots on the porch. She expected to hear them in 30 seconds. Maybe a minute if the woodshed door was stuck again. She counted the seconds without meaning to, the way the mind counts without being asked, filling silence with numbers. 30 seconds. 60. 2 minutes. She went to the window. The glass was clouded with ice on the inside, and she breathed on it to clear a small circle, and she pressed her face to it and looked out into the night. White. Nothing but white. Not falling snow that would have had movement direction, a kind of terrible beauty to it. This was something else. A ground blizzard, the kind where wind drives snow horizontal across the earth, turns the air itself into a wall of moving white that swallows everything it touches. The lantern above the cabin door cast a pale circle of light, maybe 2 feet into the storm, and then the white closed around it like a fist, and beyond those 2 feet there was nothing. No shed, no tree line, no sky, no ground, no world. Clara opened the door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a wall of force that drove the breath from her lungs and found every gap in her clothing in the first second. She called Henry's name. The wind took it. She called again louder until her voice cracked, until the cold got into her throat and turned her words into something raw and ragged. She called until she had no voice left, and then she kept calling anyway, making sounds without words, the way an animal calls without language, only need. She stood at that door all night. Eli woke at some point, she did not know when, and came down from the loft and sat on the bed behind her with a quilt pulled to his chin and his eyes wide, watching his mother shout into the white nothing, while the cold poured through the open door and the fire in the great stone fireplace slowly, steadily died. She did not find Henry that night. She did not find him the next day or the week after or the month after that. She found him when the snow melted. 3 months later, in May of 1869, lying on the frozen ground 20 feet from the cabin door, facing the wrong direction. He had gotten turned around in the white. The blizzard had taken his sense of direction, the way it takes everything, completely without apology, without leaving any trace. He had walked away from the cabin instead of toward it. He had walked away from the light, from the fire, from his wife's voice calling his name in the dark, and he had not known. The white had been absolute. The world had been erased. And 20 feet from warmth, 20 feet from survival, Henry Bergstrom had died walking in the wrong direction. Clara stood in the May mud and looked at her husband and understood for the first time what the cabin had done to him. Not the blizzard, the cabin. The cabin with its log walls 2 feet thick and its great stone fireplace and all the timber and pride that had gone into its construction. The cabin had not been warm enough to push light through 20 feet of storm. The cabin had burned through its wood supply and left Henry with no choice but to step outside into the killing cold. The cabin had let the cold seep in through every joint, every gap, every place where log met log, drinking warmth, the way sand drinks water. Never satisfied, never full, consuming cord after cord of wood, and still letting frost form on the inside of the windows on the worst nights. The cabin had killed him as surely as if it had held a knife. She knelt in the mud beside him. She took his right hand, the one closest to the ground, and she began to work the fingers open. 3 months of cold had locked the joints solid, had frozen them into a permanent grip around nothing, around the shape of a hand that had reached for something and not found it. She worked each finger slowly, carefully, without hurrying, because hurrying would have broken something, and she was not going to break anything that was left of Henry Bergstrom. It took a long time. When the last finger finally released, she reached into the curl of his palm and took the wedding ring from his cold hand. She put it on a chain she wore around her neck against her skin, where she would feel it with every heartbeat for the rest of her life. She stood up. Eli was standing behind her. She had not known he had followed. When she turned, she saw his face, 10 years old in a few months, but ancient in that moment, hollowed out by something a child's face should not have to hold. He had seen everything. The frozen fingers, the wrong direction, the 20 feet. He did not speak for 6 months after that day. During those months, Clara buried Henry. The ground was still half frozen in early May, hard as iron, refusing to yield, as though the earth itself could not accept what had happened. She built fires on the surface for 3 days and 3 nights to soften the soil enough to dig, kneeling beside the flames in the spring mud, feeding them with wood, the same kind of wood that should have kept Henry alive. She dug the grave herself, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, but 4 feet deep. Her hands blistered on the first day and bled on the second. She wrapped them in strips torn from one of Henry's shirts and kept digging. Eli sat at the window the entire time and did not speak. Scout, their collie, barely 2 years old, then lay pressed against the boy and did not move from that position, as though he had made a decision, the kind of decision that dogs make without deliberation or doubt, that this child was now his responsibility, and nothing in the world would change that. When Eli finally spoke again after 6 months of silence, he spoke only to Scout, only in whispers, only in the dark. Clara would hear him sometimes in the small hours of the night, his face buried in the warm fur of the bog, telling Scout about his father. About the afternoon, Henry had taught him to whittle on the porch, the wood shavings falling on their shoes, the sun on their faces. He told the dog the things he could not tell his mother, because telling his mother meant watching her eyes fill with a particular kind of pain that a child will do anything to prevent. Scout listened the way only dogs listen, with his whole body, with the slow thump of his tail, with the warmth of his breath against the boy's cheek. He understood nothing of the words and everything of the need, and he stayed perfectly still, a living blanket wrapped around a child's grief. One night, 3 months after the burial, Clara lay awake and heard Eli talking in his sleep. He was calling Henry's name, telling him something urgent, his voice thin and desperate in the dark. "Turn around, Papa. You are going the wrong way." Clara lay, with tears sliding into her pillow, and made a vow in the silence of that Montana night. A vow she made not with words, but with the particular quality of a decision that has been building for a long time and finally arrives complete, fully formed, unshakable as bedrock. She would never let a house kill someone she loved again. Not ever. Not if there was another way. There was another way. Her father had shown it to her. Eric Bergstrom had been a stonemason from Dalarna, in the heart of Sweden, where winters lasted 8 months and the cold could kill a man between his barn and his house. He had built root cellars that held 54 degrees year-round. He had built homes into hillsides that needed half the firewood of freestanding cabins that kept their warmth without fighting the cold, that worked with the earth instead of against it. He understood something that most builders in America had forgotten or never learned. The earth itself is a furnace. You do not need to fight winter. You need to let the ground do the work. He had taught Clara the principle of thermal mass when she was barely old enough to understand the words. Stone absorbs heat during the day and radiates it back at night. It acts as a battery storing warmth when the sun shines, releasing it when darkness falls. A wall of stone 2 feet thick backed by the earth of a hillside will hold a steady temperature regardless of what the air outside is doing. 60 degrees in winter, 60 degrees in summer. The earth does not care about blizzards. He taught her the mortar ratio. 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water, handfuls of dried grass cut short for binding. He made her repeat it until she could say it in her sleep. She suspected she still could. Stone remembers warmth like a living thing, he told her once, standing in their home that was half buried in a Swedish hillside while a blizzard screamed outside and the temperature inside sat at a comfortable 62 degrees. Wood does not. Wood only waits to burn. She remembered the winter she was 12, a storm that lasted 11 days. Neighbors lost cattle. A man 2 farms over froze to death in his own kitchen. But in the Bergstrom house built into the hill, Clara's mother grew herbs in pots set against the stone wall. The warmth from the rock was enough. Clara could remember pressing her cheek against that wall before sleep every winter, night of her childhood, feeling the gentle, steady heat as though the house itself were breathing, as though the stone were alive with the memory of every warm day that had ever touched it. Eric died when Clara was 22. His last words to her were not, "I love you." He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who expressed love through the transfer of useful knowledge, through the careful preparation of the people he cared for to survive without him. He said, "You remember the mortar ratio?" She nodded. He nodded back. Then he closed his eyes. That was how a Swedish stonemason told his daughter he loved her, by making sure she knew how to build a house that nothing could break. Clara Bergstrom arrived in Ridgecrest Valley, western Colorado, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1871. She was 34 years old. The silver at her temples had spread. Her hands were harder than they had been in Montana, calloused from 2 years of surviving alone, of doing every task that 2 people used to share, of learning that grief does not excuse you from the practical demands of existence. She came with $52 sewn into her petticoat, a Molly named May, a 4-year-old collie named Scout, and a 10-year-old boy who had not smiled in more than 2 years. The settlement sat at 7,000 feet above sea level, where the air thinned and the winters came early and stayed late. 53 families had staked claims that summer, drawn by promises of good land and fresh starts. They came from Pennsylvania and Ohio, from New York and Virginia, carrying the certainty that they knew how to build and how to survive. Most of them were building cabins, log walls, stone fireplaces, Everything the way Americans built in 1871, the way that had been handed down from one generation to the next, the way that everyone around them said was right. Clara walked her claim on her first afternoon with the Eli beside her and Scout ranging ahead through the dry autumn grass. The aspens were turning gold along the creek. The mountains to the west caught the light and held it in a way that made the air look like it was glowing from inside. She found the cave on that first afternoon opened in the hillside like a mouth 15 feet deep and 18 feet wide facing due south. The rock above it jutted out nearly 10 feet, forming a natural porch that would shed rain and snow. She stood at the entrance and pressed her palm flat against the limestone wall. The sun had been down for an hour. The stone was warm, not hot, not dramatic, just warm the way a living thing is warm, the way a body holds heat after the fire has gone out, with a steadiness that has nothing to do with any source you can point to. It was simply warm. The warmth of the earth itself held in the stone, patient and constant and completely indifferent to the cold October air an arm's length away. Her father's voice came back to her across the years and across the ocean. Stone remembers warmth like a living thing. She looked at the cave. She looked at the hillside rising above it. She thought about Henry, about the 20 feet about the cabin that had been too cold to push light through a storm, about the morning she had knelt in the mud and worked his frozen fingers open one by one. She made her decision. She would not build a cabin of logs. She would not build a house that the wind could penetrate, that the cold could seep through, that would devour cord after cord of wood and still leave frost on the inside of the windows. She would not trust the method that had killed Henry. She would build into the mountain itself. She would let the earth embrace her family. She would not fight winter. She would outlast it. Eli stood beside her, his hand resting on Scout's back. He looked at the cave, then looked at his mother. She looked back at him. There were things she could not explain to a 10-year-old boy in terms he would understand, not yet. But there were things he already understood that most adults never would. He had been present for the worst of it. He had watched her open his father's hand in the spring mud. He had sat at the window for 3 days while she dug a grave with bleeding hands. He understood in the wordless way that children understand the things that shape them, that his mother was building something more than shelter. She was building a promise, one she intended to keep. She knelt beside him. She put her hand against the warm stone. He reached out and did the same. The news traveled through Ridgecrest Valley the way fire moves through dry grass. By Sunday, everyone knew the Swedish widow was not building a proper cabin. She was digging into a hillside like an animal, mixing mud with her bare hands, stacking stones with mortar that old-timers said would crack in the first hard freeze. She was planning to live in a cave. The women gathered outside the church after the service. The conversation had the particular quality of concern that is mostly performance. The furrowed brows, the lowered voices, the careful expressions of people who are enjoying a spectacle while speaking the language of compassion. She has lost her mind, someone said. Grief does that to a person. That poor boy growing up in a hole in the ground like a wild animal. Someone should speak to her. Theodora Finch was 67 years old. She had buried 2 husbands and 3 children. She had lived in Colorado for 40 years and had seen enough winters and enough deaths and enough of the particular human arrogance that arrives wearing the costume of common sense to last several lifetimes. She listened to the performance outside the church with a face that gave nothing away, and when it was done, she walked off without a word. On the path home, she paused and looked toward the hillside where Clara was working. She remembered her own father in Tennessee. The root cellar he had dug into a red clay hillside 8 feet deep that kept potatoes fresh until June and milk from souring in August. She remembered a childhood spent in that cellar during bad storms, the warmth of the earth surrounding her, the smell of root vegetables and damp clay, her father's voice telling stories in the dark. She knew Clara Bergstrom was not crazy. She said nothing. She walked on. People only listen when winter makes them listen. Franklin Holt arrived on a gray morning when the aspens were turning, riding a fine bay horse and wearing a coat that cost more than everything Clara owned. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way of men who have never known real hardship, with the particular bearing of someone who has built something large and cannot imagine that large things can be wrong. He owned the only lumber supply in the valley. He owned the only hardware store. He owned, by some estimates, nearly a third of the settlement's outstanding debt. He was not, it must be said, a simple man. He was not a cartoon villain, not someone who had arrived in the world already darkened. He was something more complicated and more dangerous than that, a man who had come to Colorado 10 years earlier with an axe and not much else, who had turned timber into an empire through sweat and will, in the absolute certainty that he knew the right way to do things. He had built something real. He had built it with his hands. And in the building, he had arrived at the most dangerous conclusion a successful man can arrive at, that the method that had worked for him was the only method that could work. When Clara said wood did not hold warmth, she was not simply criticizing a building material. She was criticizing his entire life. He stopped his horse 20 feet from where she was digging clay from the creek bank, her skirt muddy to the knees, her hands stained red-brown with earth. "Mrs. Bergstrom," he said, making his voice carry, "I understand you are experiencing some difficulties." Clara did not look up. She continued filling her bucket, steady and methodical. The silence stretched. A robin sang somewhere in the aspens. The creek ran cold over its stones. Franklin was a man accustomed to being acknowledged immediately. The fact that a mud-covered widow made him wait was a humiliation he felt in his jaw. She let him speak. He offered lumber at reasonable prices. He offered men to help raise a proper cabin. He mentioned with practiced concern that a widow with a young son should not be living in a hole in the ground. Then Clara looked up. She met his eyes with the flat calm of a woman who has already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person and therefore approaches all lesser threats with a certain equanimity. "I am not living in a hole," she said. "I am building a home." Franklin tried persuasion. He tried sympathy. He mentioned Henry's death with the careful gravity of a man who uses other people's grief as a tool. "Surely you can see that grief can cloud a person's judgment." Clara set down her bucket. She straightened her back. She was not a tall woman, but something in her bearing made Franklin's horse shift nervously beneath him. "My husband died 20 feet from our cabin door," she said. "He went out for firewood because the cabin had burned through everything we had. He froze to death within shouting distance of his own home. That cabin had log walls 2 feet thick. It had a stone fireplace. It had everything your lumber could provide. And it killed him." Franklin stiffened. "With respect, the cabin?" She picked up her bucket. "I will not make that mistake twice." Franklin turned his horse and rode away. The conversation was over. But at 50 feet he stopped. He did not look back. He sat motionless in the saddle, staring at the mountains to the west, and he stayed that way for a long moment that stretched until it became uncomfortable to watch. Then he spurred the horse forward. What no one watching could have seen, what only Franklin knew, was what had happened in that long, motionless moment. It was not calculation. It was not planning. It was something simpler and more painful than either of those things. He had thought about Dorinda, about the extra blanket she always pulled over herself in January, about the way she never complained, never said a word about the cold, just quietly added another layer every winter, as though cold were simply a condition of existence to be endured rather than solved. He had thought about Edwin, about the cough that started every November and did not leave until March, about the sound of the boy in the mornings before the fire was built up, that particular kind of cough that comes from lungs that have spent the night breathing air too cold for lungs. He knew. That was the unbearable part of it, the part he would carry in his chest for the rest of the year, without naming it, turning it over in the dark hours without ever letting himself look at it directly. He knew his cabin was cold, and if Clara Bergstrom was right, if there was genuinely another way, a better way, a way that kept people warm without the endless consumption of wood that he sold by the cord, then every family in the valley that had bought his lumber and built his way was living in a house that was slowly losing its war against the cold. Every child coughing in the mornings. Every woman who slept under one too many blankets. Every man who stepped outside on a bitter night for a task that should have taken 30 seconds and found himself in a fight he had not expected. He could not carry that. He simply could not. So he made a different decision. Not a plan, not yet just a direction. Clara Bergstrom had to fail. Not because he hated her, not because he was evil, because the alternative was something he could not live with. And self-preservation wears many costumes, and sometimes it wears the costume of righteousness. He spurred the horse and did not look back. That evening, Wallace sat in the back room of his store surrounded by ledgers and lamplight. He had sent word to certain men in the settlement. They arrived one by one and took seats on upturned crates and waited. Virgil Moss was 22 years old, eager and hollow in the particular way of young men who have not yet found a thing they believe in and are therefore willing to believe in whoever seems most certain. Reverend Aldous Crane sat in the corner with his hands folded and his face arranged in an expression that was supposed to look neutral. He owed Franklin Holt $87 a fortune in that place, and time the kind of debt that changes the color of a man's conscience, whether he intends it to or not. Two others completed the group men with debts of their own men who had learned that the fastest way to reduce what you owe someone is to become useful to them. Franklin did not ask for direct action. He was too careful for that. He asked for questions, concerns, observations shared among neighbors in the natural course of neighborly conversation. How does she expect that cave to stay warm when proper cabins freeze? What kind of knowledge does a woman like that have? Who taught her these strange methods? He let the implications settle into the room like smoke, slow without drama, finding their way into every corner. Reverend Crane walked home alone afterward. He sat before his Bible for a long time with his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He turned to the passage where Pilate washes his hands before the crowd. He read it once. He read it again. He closed the book. He did not sleep that night. He would remember that he had not slept. Later, when it mattered, he would hold on to that, the fact that he had known that some part of him had refused the comfort of unconsciousness, that his body had insisted on keeping him awake with what he was doing. It would not be enough to undo what came next, but it would be the seed of what came later. 1 week before the whispers found their shape and grew teeth, something happened that cracked open the first light in Clara's world since Henry died. Theodora Finch appeared at the cave. Clara was mixing mortar when the old woman arrived. She came alone, walking carefully across the rough ground, and she stood at the edge of the worksite without speaking, watching. Clara kept working. The silence was comfortable, the silence of two people who understand that words are not always the most efficient form of communication. My father built a root cellar into a hillside in Tennessee, Theodora said finally, dug back 8 feet into red clay. That cellar kept potatoes fresh until June, kept the preserves from freezing in January. Temperature stayed the same year-round, about 54 degrees. She stepped closer to the wall. Her eyes moved over the stonework with the attention of someone assessing structural quality rather than offering social approval. Everyone thought he was crazy too. Something loosened in Clara's chest, something she had not known was tight until it released. For the first time since arriving in Ridgecrest Valley, she felt seen. Not pitied, not judged, not observed as a curiosity or a cautionary tale. Simply seen. My father was a stonemason in Sweden, Clara said. He built homes into hillsides. He said the earth holds warmth like a living thing. Theodora nodded slowly. The old ways. People forget them. Then the old ways come back and remind us why they existed. She turned to go, then paused. She did not say, I believe in you. She did not say, I am rooting for you. She was not the kind of woman who expressed support through the currency of words when the currency of action was available. She said, I will send you 2 buckets of lard. Mix it into your outer plaster. Water will not seep into the mortar. Then she walked away without looking back. 2 buckets of lard appeared at the cave entrance the following morning. No note, no explanation. Just the lard in 2 clean wooden buckets placed where Clara would find them when she came to start the day's work. Clara stood and looked at those buckets for a long time. Then she sat down on a stone and wept. Not from sorrow, she had done enough of that kind of weeping to last several lifetimes. She wept from relief from the sudden, overwhelming discovery that she was not entirely alone in this, that somewhere in this valley of skeptics and doubters and people who called her a cave woman behind her back, there was one old woman who had pressed her cheek against warm stone in a Tennessee root cellar and understood. That night in the tent where Clara and Eli slept while the cave was still under construction, Eli spoke to her, not to Scout, to her, Mama. She turned toward him in the dark. Is the cave going to keep us safe? She looked at her son, at the thin shoulders and the serious eyes, at the boy who had seen too much and asked for too little, who had carried grief the way small creatures carry things too large for them stubbornly, without complaint because there is no alternative. She thought of Henry facing the wrong direction in the snow. She thought of her father warm in his hillside home while blizzards raged outside. She thought of every single thing she knew and every single thing she had lost in the distance between them, which was exactly 20 feet. Yes, she said, the cave will keep us safe, promise. She looked at her hands in the darkness, calloused, cracked, stained with earth stronger than her small frame suggested. Her father's hands, hands that knew how to build something that nothing could break. I promise. Eli settled back. Scout pressed closer to the boy, his warm flank rising and falling, with the slow breath of a dog at peace with his position in the world. The wind moved over the tent. Outside, the mountains held their ground in the dark as they had always done, patient and indifferent and full of the slow warmth of the earth's own making. Clara lay awake for a long time. A promise is only as strong as the hands that build it. In the morning, she went back to work. 6 weeks before the snow would come to test everything she believed and everything she had built. She knelt at the mouth of the cave, and the early southern sun fell across her back like a hand laid gently between her shoulders. Eli sat beside her. For the first time, he had come without being asked. His small hands mimicked her larger ones, pressing clay into stone, learning the rhythm. Scout lay at the entrance, watching, guarding, ears up, eyes moving across the hillside. A mother and a boy walked, building a home out of mud and stone, while the whole valley laughed. But stone does not care who laughs. Stone only remembers warmth. Astrid Voss arrived in Ridgecrest Valley on the last day of October, with a broken wagon wheel, 2 sons, and a grief she carried, the way some women carry scripture, close to the chest, silent and always present. She was 45 years old. Her face was strong and weathered, carved by wind and loss into something that did not ask for sympathy and did not offer explanation. She had come from Minnesota by way of Norway, traveling west toward California where her brother ran a ranch, and had written to say there was work and space and a place to begin again. The broken wheel had stopped her here in this valley at 7,000 feet, where the aspens had already dropped their gold, and the mornings carried the particular sharp cold that precedes the first serious snow. She heard about the crazy Swedish woman within an hour of arriving at the general store to arrange repairs. She went to see for herself within 2. Clara was working on the interior wall when the older woman appeared, picking her way across the rough ground with the careful steps of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask permission. She walked directly to the wall and placed her hand flat against the stones, feeling the way they held together, examining the mortar with fingers that knew construction, the way hands know things that belong to them. She tested the weight and balance of a cornerstone with the practiced touch of someone who had watched builders work her entire life. It was the gesture of one pair of hands recognizing another. She said, "My mother built houses like this. In Trondheim, into the hills with stone walls and sod roofs. She lived to 89, never sick a day in her life." Clara set down her trowel. "You understand," she said. It was not a question. Astrid turned to face her. "My husband died in a cabin. A good cabin, log walls, stone fireplace, everything the way Americans build. Minnesota 4 years ago. The cold came through the walls like they were not there. He went to sleep and did not wake up. I was in the bed beside him. I survived because I was closer to the fire. Our son was in the loft." She paused. In that pause lived 4 years of sleepless nights and silent meals, and a woman putting one foot in front of the other because 2 boys needed her to keep walking. "He lost 3 toes," Clara said quietly. "My husband died too. Montana. He went out for firewood and never came back." The 2 women looked at each other across the cold October air, across the gulf of shared grief and shared knowledge and shared determination. They did not embrace. They did not weep. They had both done enough of that in private to last several lifetimes. They simply stood in the thin mountain air and recognized each other the way survivors do, not by what they say, but by what they carry behind their eyes. Astrid's sons were Berger, 17, and Peter, 14. Berger was tall and quiet, with his mother's careful intelligence and his mother's patience, the kind of patience that is willing to do the same thing 50 times until it is right. Peter was stockier, more talkative, with a gift for drawing out frightened things, a gentleness masked by humor that could coax a response from the most guarded of creatures. Within the first hour, Berger was mixing mortar alongside Clara, learning the ratio 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water, with the focused attention of a young man who understood that useful knowledge was worth more than most things the world offered. Peter's first project was Eli. The boy watched the newcomers from behind the scout, speaking only in whispers, his eyes moving between the strangers with the wariness of a child who has learned that the world changes without warning and that new people represent the possibility of new losses. Scout pressed against his legs. The dog's ears were up, tracking everything ready to move. Peter did not try to talk to Eli directly at first. He simply worked nearby carrying stones and water buckets, narrating his own actions in a quiet, unhurried voice, not performing, not trying to entertain, just talking the way someone talks when they are comfortable, and not asking anything from anyone. He talked about a goat his grandfather had owned in Norway, a goat of legendary stubbornness and equally legendary appetite. The goat had once eaten an entire tobacco pouch, chewed it thoughtfully for the better part of an hour, and then sneezed so violently it knocked over a full milk pail. Eli was listening. Clara could see it, the small shift in posture, the way the boy's body angled slightly toward the sound of Peter's voice, even as he kept his eyes on the ground. By the third day, Peter had Eli laughing. A real laugh, unexpected, bright, the kind of sound that startles everyone in earshot because it has been absent long enough that people have begun to forget it belonged there. Clara heard it from inside the cave where she was fitting stones into the chimney. She stopped what she was doing. She stood very still and listened to the sound of her son laughing. It moved through her chest like something physical, like a key turning in a lock she had stopped believing would ever open. She went back to work before anyone could see her face. By the fifth day, Eli was carrying the water buckets without being asked. By the seventh, he was mixing mortar alongside Birger, his small hands working the clay with fierce concentration, his brow furrowed with the seriousness of someone who has been entrusted with something important. One afternoon, Birger showed Eli how to test stones. He picked up a piece of limestone and held it to his ear, then struck it lightly with a smaller rock. "Hear that," he said, clear and bright, like a small bell. "That is a stone you can trust." He picked up another piece, struck it the same way. A dull, flat sound, not a ring, but a thud without resonance. "Hear the difference that one is cracked inside. Looks fine on the outside, but it will fail when the cold comes. The freeze gets into the crack and expands, and what looks solid becomes rubble overnight." Eli became immediately and completely fascinated. He began sorting the stone pile into two categories with the seriousness of a jeweler grading diamonds, tapping each piece, holding it close to his ear, listening, then nodding or shaking his head with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere older than 10 years old. The good pile grew on the left. The questionable pile grew on the right. He did not allow compromise. Clara watched her son and felt something catch in her throat that was not grief and was not quite joy, but lived in the territory between them. The boy was learning with his hands, learning with his ears, learning through the patient repetition of craft, the way his grandfather Eric had learned, the way she had learned, the way knowledge moves through generations when it is passed carefully from one pair of hands to the next. One evening after Berger and Peter had returned to their campsite and the light was failing, Eli sat beside the small fire outside the cave and asked a question that stopped Clara mid-motion. "Mama, why does stone hold warmth?" She set down her tools. She sat across from him. She explained it the way her father had explained it to her, simply and directly, without condescension, the way you speak to someone you are training rather than someone you are placating. Stone is like a battery. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night. The thicker the stone, the more heat it stores. The earth behind the stone adds even more because underground temperatures stay constant regardless of what the weather does above. The cave is backed by the whole mountain. The mountain does not care what the wind does. It holds its temperature the way the ocean holds its temperature, slowly, stubbornly, with the weight of everything it contains. Eli was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Scout lay between them with his head on his paws, one ear cocked toward the boy, always listening. "So Papa's cabin was like a leaky bucket," Eli said. "Pour heat in all you want. It just runs out through the cracks." Clara looked at her son, at the precise, unsentimental accuracy of that description, at the mind working behind the serious eyes. "That is exactly right," she said. He looked at his hands still stained with clay from the day's work. "I want to learn the mortar ratio. 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water." He repeated it back to her without hesitation, the words settling into his memory with the solidity of something learned at exactly the right moment, from exactly the right person, for exactly the right reason. She heard her father's voice in the exchange, the way knowledge sounds when it is being transmitted with intention rather than merely displayed. She smiled. She could not remember the last time she had smiled like that, not the careful social smile she offered the settlement, not the determined smile she wore for Eli's benefit, but a real one coming from somewhere below deliberate control. Her father's knowledge passing through her hands into her son's. A chain that stretched from Dalarna to Montana to this cave in Colorado unbroken despite everything that had tried to break it. The 2 weeks that Astrid and her son spent in Ridgecrest Valley were the hardest and the happiest Clara had known since before Henry died. The wall rose steadily, first to waist height, then to shoulder height, then finally to meet the natural stone ceiling of the cave. They left openings for a door narrow at 30 inches to minimize heat loss, in 2 windows 18 inches square, positioned to catch the southern sun throughout the shortest days of winter. The mortar dried slowly in the autumn air, bonding the stones, together with a grip that time would eventually prove could outlast a great many things people had been more confident about. Clara built the chimney herself, working from memory and from the image of her father's hands, which she carried with her as clearly as she carried his wedding ring. The chimney was 12 feet tall, with a straight vertical shaft and a slight taper wide at the base to create good draw narrower at the top to retain heat. At the base inside the cave, she constructed a firebox of flat stone with a cast iron grate purchased in Denver before heading north. She built what her father called the breath of the house, a small clay pipe running from outside beneath the cave floor to the base of the firebox so that the fire could draw fresh air without anyone needing to open the door. A continuous cycle of ventilation, silent and self-sustaining, the house breathing on its own. Behind the firebox, she constructed a heat wall 18 inches of solid stone positioned to absorb the fire's warmth throughout the day and radiate it back throughout the night long after the flames had died to coals. Harcourt Stratton, the engineer from Philadelphia, came to observe one afternoon. He walked around the site with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the particular expression of professional skepticism that men with advanced degrees wear when confronted by solutions that precede their theories. He had built bridges. He understood load-bearing and tensile strength and all the precise vocabulary of modern construction. What he did not understand and what he would not understand until the storm taught him was that the Earth had been solving structural and thermal problems for 4 billion years before Philadelphia existed. The clay will crack, he announced. First hard freeze, you will see fractures throughout the mortar. Water will seep, freeze and expand. By spring, this wall will be rubble. Clara did not stop working. Not if it is thick enough, not if the overhang protects it, not if it is properly sealed. Stratton shook his head. I have seen this before. People from the old country bringing primitive techniques, thinking they understand engineering better than people who have actually studied it. He left. Clara kept working. But that night alone outside the tent while Eli slept and Scout breathed steadily against the boy's back, she allowed the doubt to come. It arrived the way doubt always arrives when you are tired, not as argument, but as erosion wearing away at the foundations without announcing itself. Stratton was educated. He had built real things. What did she have? Memories of her father's voice, faith in techniques that no one around her recognized or respected. She sat with the doubt for a long time. Let it say what it had to say. Then she looked at her hands. She thought about the mortar ratio. 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water. Her father had made her repeat it until she could say it in her sleep. That was not an emotional memory. That was not something grief had colored or desperation had inflated. That was knowledge. Specific, testable, repeatable knowledge. The kind that does not lie because it has no interest in lying. It simply is. Knowledge does not care whether you believe in it. She went back to her calculations. The chimney had to be finished. Winter was not going to wait for anyone's confidence. Astrid and her sons left in mid-November. The wagon wheel had been repaired, and California was calling them westward with the particular insistence of a promise that cannot be deferred indefinitely. The morning of their departure, Astrid pressed a small cloth bag into Clara's hands. Seeds, beans, squash, corn. For spring, she said, when you have proved everyone wrong and you are still here. She also told Clara about her brother's ranch in California. Dozens of workers who would need houses. Houses that would not kill them the way that Minnesota cabin had killed her husband. If Clara's method survived the winter, if the cave stood and the mortar held, and the stone kept its warmth through the worst that Colorado could offer. Astrid wanted her to come. Good pay, a new start, a place to teach what she knew to people who needed to learn it. Write to me in spring, Clara said, if we are still here. Astrid held her for a long moment, the way women hold each other when they know that letting go means returning to a world where no one else quite understands. Then she climbed into the wagon, and Berger took the reins, and Peter called something to Eli that made the boy laugh again. That bright, unexpected sound before the wagon rolled south, and the dust settled back onto the road and the valley was quiet. Clara watched until they were gone. Then she went back to work. There was still so much to do. The rumors found her 3 weeks later, delivered by the one man in the valley, decent enough to warn her. Owen Hadley was roughly 40 years old with the quiet competence of a man who lets his work speak louder than his opinions. He was the best carpenter in Ridgecrest Valley, and he had agreed to build Clara's door, a job he had taken on because the work was straightforward and honest work was something Owen Hadley valued above most things. He came on a cold morning in late November, his face carrying two things simultaneously, shame and anger that were fighting each other for the same space. Mrs. Bergstrom, he said, I need to tell you something. He told her. Franklin Holt had come to him the previous week. If Owen did any further work for Clara, Franklin would cut off his lumber supply, would make sure no one in the valley hired him for anything, would call in a small debt Owen had been managing carefully, the kind of debt that can be managed indefinitely as long as the creditor is patient and becomes immediately unmanageable the moment the creditor decides patience is over. Owen's wife had died 6 years earlier, cancer slow and merciless. He had made her promises at the end, the kind that are not negotiable. His daughter Nell was 16 now. She was everything he had. I have a daughter, Mrs. Bergstrom, he said. I cannot risk what she depends on. I cannot risk it on this. Clara looked at him steadily. I understand, she said. You have to protect your family. I do not hold it against you. Something moved across Owen's face, relief colliding with something that looked like self-contempt. The expression of a man who knows he is making the right choice for the wrong reasons, or the wrong choice for the right ones, and cannot quite determine which. But I want you to know, he said, what he is doing is wrong. The things he is saying about you. He paused. You are not a witch. You are a woman trying to keep her boy alive. And I think your way might be better than ours. I think that is what really scares him. He left before she could respond. 3 days later, a set of iron hinges appeared at the cave entrance. No note, no explanation. Just 4 good iron hinges, the kind only a skilled carpenter would own, arranged neatly on a flat stone where Clara would find them in the morning. Owen Hadley could not build her door, but he could forget a set of hinges in the right place. Clara understood. She built the door herself from driftwood gathered along the creek. It was rougher than what Owen would have made, uneven in places, lacking the craftsman's polish that comes from a lifetime of practice. But it fit tight in the frame, and the hinges swung smooth and true, and Owen's hands were present in that door, even though Owen himself could not be. The whispers that Franklin had planted took their time growing. They moved through the settlement the way all rumors move, person to person, gathering detail with each telling, becoming more certain and more elaborate as they traveled further from any source that might check them. She keeps a fire that never goes out. How does a fire never go out? She talks to the rocks. Someone heard her. Her dog never leaves the entrance. Like it is guarding something. Like it was trained for something. The boy doesn't speak. Children who have seen certain things stop speaking. It was not one person saying which. It was many people saying the words that circle around that word without touching it, laying kindling around a fire they want someone else to light, creating the conditions for something they cannot be directly blamed for. Franklin Holt was careful. He was always careful. Reverend Aldous Crane preached a sermon on the dangers of pride and the wisdom of community. He did not name Clara. He did not have to. The congregation knew who the sermon was about, and so did the Reverend, and so did the God he claimed to speak for, and the Reverend knew that too, and that knowledge sat on his chest every morning when he woke, and every night when he could not sleep, heavy and specific and without absolution. The confrontation came on a cold afternoon in December near the creek where Clara collected clay. Edwin Holt was 13 years old, broad-shouldered, like his father, carrying the easy cruelty that grows in children who have been told implicitly and repeatedly that the world is organized around their comfort. Two boys flanked him, younger and eager to follow the lead of someone who seemed to know where he was going. Cave boy Edwin called out, "Where is your witch mother?" Eli froze. Scout pressed against his legs. A growl built low in the dog's chest, quiet, steady. Not a warning exactly, but something more considered than a warning. A statement of intent. My mother is not a witch. That is not what everyone says. 2 years. Eli had been swallowing for 2 years, the grief, the silence, the move, the new valley, the neighbors who called his mother crazy, the boys who laughed at where they lived, the mornings he woke up and reached for his father and found only the cold fact of absence. 2 years of swallowing, and now Edwin Holt standing in the December cold telling him what everyone says. There is only so much space inside a 10-year-old boy. Edwin shoved Eli hard. The smaller boy stumbled, caught himself, stood his ground. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been building since a May morning in Montana when he stood in the mud and watched his mother work his father's frozen hand open finger by finger. Eli swung. His fist caught Edwin square on the nose. Blood sprayed against the cold air, bright and sudden, and Edwin's howl broke the valley's quiet like something thrown through glass. Then all three boys were on Eli, and Scout was barking a deep, furious sound that had nothing in it of uncertainty, and the world dissolved into fists and cold ground, and the particular chaos that arrives when suppressed things finally surface. Clara heard it from the cave and ran. By the time she arrived, Scout had his teeth in Edwin's forearm. Not ripping, holding. The dog had made a careful, deliberate decision, and he was carrying it out with the controlled precision of an animal who knows exactly what he is doing and why. The other two boys had backed to a safe distance, their bravado evaporating in the face of bared teeth and 100 pounds of focused intention. Clara commanded Scout to release. He obeyed immediately, letting go, stepping back, but planting himself directly in front of Eli with his hackles raised and a growl running steady and low in his chest like distant machinery. She helped Eli to his feet, checked his injuries quickly, professionally cataloging the split lip and the bruised jaw and the torn knee of his trousers with the clinical efficiency of a mother who needs facts before she allows herself to feel. Then she turned to Edwin. Edwin was crying blood from his nose, mixing with tears, his forearm cradled against his chest. He looked in that moment like what he actually was underneath the cruelty he had borrowed from his father, a 13-year-old boy who had gotten considerably more than he had expected. Your dog attacked me, he said. He is vicious. He should be put down. Clara's voice was flat and even and entirely without warmth. Your dog protected my son from three boys who attacked him. If you want to discuss viciousness, we can discuss who started this. Edwin ran shouting back over his shoulder threats about what his father would do, what would happen to Scout, what Clara would see. His voice disappeared around the bend in the creek, and the valley went quiet again, except for the water moving over stones. 1 hour later, Franklin Holt stood at the edge of Clara's property with a rifle in his hands. He was not pointing it at anyone. He was simply holding it the way men hold power, not necessarily using it, but making its presence visible, letting the fact of it do work that words do not need to. Your animal attacked my son, he said. The law gives me the right to put down a dangerous dog. Clara positioned herself directly in front of Scout. Behind her, she heard Eli's footsteps, the boy moving to stand beside her, not behind her. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on Franklin. Samuel felt Scout's fur under his fingers, gripping the thick ruff at the dog's neck. His whole body was trembling, but he did not run. Your son attacked my son, Clara said. 3 against 1. My dog defended his family. That is not dangerous. That is loyal. I have witnesses. You have boys who will say whatever your son tells them to say. Franklin shifted the rifle slightly, not aiming, not threatening exactly, but adjusting the way a man adjusts an argument when he feels it slipping. Step aside, Mrs. Bergstrom. No. 1 word. 2 letters. Containing everything, every stone she had placed, every handful of mortar she had mixed, every night she had lain awake turning the doubt over in her hands and setting it aside, every promise she had made to a 10-year-old boy in the dark. The silence between them had weight and edges. Then Clara took a step toward him. Not back. Forward. You touch my dog, she said, and you will have to explain to this entire valley why a man with a rifle was threatening a widow and her child over a schoolyard fight. You will have to explain the rumors you have been spreading. You will have to explain why you told Owen Hadley not to do business with me. She took another step, Franklin did not move back, but something shifted in him, a small internal rearrangement invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. I have nothing, she said. A cave, a child, a dog, no money, no power, no influence. But I have the truth. And the truth is that you are a man who cannot stand to see a woman succeed where you said she would fail. Franklin's knuckles whitened on the rifle. The moment stretched. The mountains stood in their usual indifference to human difficulty. The wind moved through the dry grass. Gout held completely still, not growling now, just watching with the patience of a creature who has decided what it will do if the situation requires it. Then Franklin lowered the rifle. "This is not over," he said. The words of a man who has retreated but is not finished. He turned and walked away. That evening, Dorinda Holt looked at the rifle on the kitchen table. She looked at her husband. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. She had known for months the way wives know not from evidence, but from the particular quality of silence that fills a house when a man is doing something he cannot defend. The silence had been getting heavier for weeks, accumulating the way snow accumulates quietly and without drama until the weight of it becomes structural. She said nothing. She set the kettle on the stove and did not speak. Franklin sat at the table for a long time that night, not reading, not planning, not doing the things he normally did in the evenings. Just sitting. With the rifle on the table and the silence of his wife moving through the room like weather, and the memory of Clara Bergstrom stepping toward him rather than away, and the specific unwelcome knowledge that he was losing something he could not name but had always counted on. On the 15th of November, the first real test arrived. It was not the blizzard that Silas Pruitt would later recognize in the sky on the 23rd of December. It was something smaller, a 3-day cold snap that dropped the temperature to 18 below and kept it there with wind out of the northwest that found every gap in every structure in the valley and let the cold know about it. In Franklin Holt's cabin, ice formed on the inside of the windows within hours. The fire in the stone fireplace roared and consumed wood at a rate that made Dorinda's eyes move to the woodpile with quiet arithmetic. In the cave that everyone called a bear den, Clara sat at her new table reading by lamplight, wearing a wool dress. The thermometer on the wall read 66 degrees. Eli slept in his bed with a single blanket. Scout lay at his feet, warm and content, his nose tucked under his tail in the posture of a dog who has no complaints about his situation. The fire in the stone firebox burned steadily, consuming perhaps a third of the wood that was disappearing from Franklin Holt's pile. The heat wall radiated its stored warmth into the room like a second sun, silent, constant, requiring nothing from anyone. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Clara walked down to the settlement. She saw people stumbling from cabins with armfuls of furniture legs and broken shelving, heading to the woodpile to replace what they had burned. She saw women wrapping children in every available layer, their faces showing the specific weariness that comes from 3 days of constant fire tending, constant vigilance, constant cold. She saw men who looked like they had spent 72 hours in a slow fight they had not known they were in. She found Harcourt Stratton standing outside his door, his coat buttoned wrong, his hat missing. He looked at her clean face and clear eyes and the color in her cheeks with an expression that ran through several stages before settling into something that was not quite humility, but was at least its cousin. "How did you fare?" she asked. "We managed," he said. The word managed doing a considerable amount of work. 3 days of feeding a fire that could never quite win, of sleeping in shifts of watching ice form on the inside of windows that were supposed to keep the cold out. "My cave held at 66 degrees, Clara said. "I burned perhaps a quarter cord in 3 days. The walls are warm to the touch. There are no cracks in the mortar." She was not boasting. Her voice had the specific quality of someone reporting facts that are simply true in the same register she would use to report the temperature outside or the depth of the snowfall. Facts do not require enthusiasm. If you would like to see, you are welcome to visit. She walked away. Stratton stood in his doorway for a long time after she left running numbers in his head that all arrived at the same answer, an answer his Philadelphia education had not prepared him for, but which the last 3 days had made entirely unavoidable. Silas Pruitt came to the cave one afternoon in early December. He was 74 years old, the oldest person in the valley, a former miner who had spent 30 years working underground before his back gave out. He walked with a cane, now slow and deliberate, but his eyes were still sharp and curious, and capable of seeing things that younger men missed because they were too busy being certain to look carefully. He stood inside the cave for a long time with his gnarled hand pressed flat against the limestone wall, feeling the warmth with the reverence of a man who had spent his life surrounded by rock and understood its language in a way that engineers with their degrees and merchants with their certainties never quite would. I worked in mines for 30 years, he said. Down in the earth, the temperature stays the same. Summer, winter doesn't matter. About 54 degrees. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets. He turned to Clara with something in his eyes that was close to wonder. You figured out how to bring the mind to the surface. Let the earth's warmth do the work instead of fighting it. My father taught me, Clara said. Silas shook his head slowly. The rest of us have been fighting the earth our whole lives, building on top of it, trying to keep it out. Never occurred to us to let it in. Then his voice changed, grew heavier the way a man's voice grows heavy when he is about to carry something he has been carrying alone for too long and has finally found someone who might help him hold it. He told her about his grandson Corbin, about Corbin's wife Marin, about their baby girl 6 months old who coughed every night with a wet rattling sound that filled the dark hours with a particular quality of fear that parents of sick infants know and that no one else can quite describe. He had been telling them to come talk to Clara to learn what she knew. But Marin had been listening to the talk in the settlement, the talk about witchcraft, the talk that Franklin Holt had planted and Virgil Moss had watered, and Reverend Crane had failed to uproot when he had the chance. He paused at the cave entrance, looked at Clara for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has seen 74 years of people making decisions they cannot take back. The scariest thing in the world, he said, almost to himself, is not winter. It is watching danger come towards someone you love, knowing how to avoid it, and not being able to make them listen. He walked away. Clara watched him go and understood that he was not only speaking about Corbin and Marin and the baby, he was speaking about himself, about a 74-year-old man who had lived long enough to know what was coming and old enough to have lost most of the ways a man tries to stop it. On the 23rd of December, Silas Pruitt stepped outside before dawn and looked up at the sky. He stood there for a full minute without moving. The sky was the color of old iron, a low, heavy ceiling pressing down on the mountains like a hand about to close. The air had a quality he could not name, except to say it felt wrong. Too still, too heavy, carrying something in it that had no name in ordinary weather. He had seen that sky once before, in 1856. He had been working a mine in the San Juan Range that winter, and the men who had lived in those mountains for decades had looked up at that same sky and walked away from the mine without being told, without discussion, with the efficient purposefulness of creatures that do not require explanation to respond to certain information. The storm that followed had killed 11 people across 4 counties. It had buried entire encampments under drifts that took 3 weeks to melt. It had erased roads and trails and landmarks and reshaped the landscape with the casual power of something that does not notice what it is doing because the scale of what it is doing is beyond the category of noticing. He went directly to Clara. Storm coming, he said. Bad one. Maybe the worst I have seen in 40 years. Clara looked at the sky. She looked at Scout, who was pacing in short back and forth lines near the cave entrance, whining softly, his ears flat against his skull, in the posture that meant something the dog's senses had registered that human senses had not yet caught up with. How long, she asked. Tonight, he said. Maybe tomorrow morning at the latest. Clara spent the rest of that day walking through the settlement. She went door to door speaking clearly and without drama, repeating the same message. A bad storm was coming, possibly the worst in decades, and anyone who was uncertain about their wood supply or the integrity of their roof should consider seeking better shelter before it arrived. Most people thanked her politely. Most people did not listen. She stopped at Augustin Weld's cabin on the edge of the settlement. He was 78 years old, living alone since his wife died 12 years earlier. His only son had been killed at Shiloh, leaving behind a silence in Augustin's life that had never been filled, only gradually accepted. He sat on the porch mending rope with the patient efficiency of a man who keeps his hands busy so his mind does not dwell too long on what is absent. His woodpile, Clara noted, was smaller than it should have been for late December. Considerably smaller. Mr. Weld, a serious storm is coming. You should come to the cave tonight. Augustin looked up at her with pale blue eyes that held amusement and stubbornness in the particular combination that certain men develop over many decades of surviving things. I have lived through 50 Colorado winters, young lady. I think I know how to handle snow. This storm is different. Silas Pruitt says it may be the worst in 40 years. Augustine nodded pleasantly. I appreciate the concern, but I am fine right here. She looked at his woodpile. She knew the arithmetic it represented. She also knew this kind of man. She had known them all her life, the kind whose independence has kept them alive through things that would have broken someone softer and who have therefore come to mistake independence for invulnerability. Pushing harder would only close him down further. If you change your mind, she said, my door is always open. Augustine smiled at her warmly, firmly. The smile of a man who has made his decision and does not require further input. I appreciate that, Mrs. Bergstrom. She walked away. She looked back once. Augustin was still sitting straight-backed on his porch, working his rope in the failing light with the unhurried concentration of a man who intends to finish what he has started. She thought he will not finish it. Her last stop was the Pruitt cabin. Corbin opened the door, young and hard-faced, wearing the rigid certainty of a man who is terrified and covering it with stubbornness because he does not know how else to hold himself together. Marin stood behind him with the baby in her arms. The baby's cheeks were flushed even now, even in December. The cough was audible from the doorway. We do not need your kind of help, Corbin said. Clara looked at the baby, at the small, flushed face, at the chest rising and falling with the particular labored rhythm of an infant fighting something it should not have to fight. It is not witchcraft, she said. It is knowledge. The same knowledge that kept 14 people alive through the 3-day cold snap last month. Knowledge that could keep your daughter warm tonight. Marin's arms tightened around the baby. Just go, Corbin said. Please, just leave us alone. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked past him at Marin, at the fear behind the defiance in the young woman's eyes. The fear of someone who is not entirely certain she has made the right choice and knows that the cost of being wrong will be measured in something she cannot replace. Even now, she said, if you change your mind, my door will be open. She turned and walked back toward the cave. The sky above her was the color of bruised pewter pressing down on the valley with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. She passed Silas Pruitt's window on the way. He was standing inside looking out. Their eyes met through the glass. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Two people who knew what was coming and were powerless to stop the part of it that depended on other people making different choices than they were going to make. Clara reached the cave. She closed the door. She set the bar. Eli sat on his bed. Scout was already at his feet. The thermometer read 64 degrees. Outside, the wind began to moan. Not yet a roar, just a murmur, the way certain kinds of danger begin quietly, almost gently, with the patience of something that knows it does not need to hurry. Are we ready, Mama? She looked at the wall she had built, at the mortar that Harcourt Stratton had said would crack and that had not cracked, at the chimney drawing clean and straight, at the heat wall already warm to the touch, already storing what the fire gave, it already preparing to give it back through the long hours of the night. We are ready, she said. The wind began to rise. The blizzard hit at 11:47 that night. Clara was still awake, sitting by the fire with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold sometime in the last hour, listening to the wind build itself into something that no longer resembled wind. Wind has rhythm. Wind has intervals, spaces between gusts where the world catches its breath. What came out of the northwest at 11:47 had none of that. It was continuous. A single sustained roar that did not peak and fall but simply arrived at full force and stayed there, as though the sky had made a decision and intended to hold to it. She went to the door and cracked it open 2 inches. The force on the other side nearly tore it from her hands. She braced her shoulder against the wood and looked out into nothing. Literally nothing. The snow was not falling, it was flying horizontal in absolute, so thick and so fast that the lantern above the cave entrance cast its light perhaps 2 feet before the white swallowed it completely. Beyond those 2 feet, the world had ceased to exist. There was no valley, no settlement, no mountains, no sky. There was only the white moving, with a fury that felt personal, that felt like something with intention behind it, something that had been patient for a long time and was no longer. The cold that came through that 2-inch gap was not temperature. It was a physical force, a living pressure that drove itself against her face and found the gap at her collar and the space at her wrists and pushed into those gaps with the mindless persistence of something that does not feel fatigue. She slammed the door, dropped the bar, leaned against it. Eli was sitting up in bed, his eyes showing white all around. Scout was pressed against him, both ears flat, a high, thin whine coming from the back of the dog's throat. Not a sound of aggression, but of something more primitive, the sound of an animal registering a threat too large for aggression to address. Clara crossed the cave in 3 steps and pulled them both close. The boy and the dog together, Eli's thin body shaking against her, Scout's warmth pressing into them both from the other side. "It is all right," she said. "We are inside. The storm cannot reach us here." She looked at the wall over Eli's shoulder. The wall she had built stone by stone through October and November with her own hands, with the hands of 2 boys from Norway and a 10-year-old learning to sort stone by sound. The mortar that Harcourt Stratton had said would crack in the first freeze. The chimney drawing clean and true, despite the wind hammering at the valley outside. The heat wall warm to the touch, radiating its stored warmth into the room with the indifferent generosity of something that simply does what it does, without drama, without requiring appreciation. The thermometer on the wall read 64 degrees. "We are safe," she said again. And for the first time since Henry had walked out a cabin door in Montana and not come back, the words did not feel like a prayer. They felt like a fact. A fact she had built with her own hands, stone by stone, from the knowledge her father had placed in her hands, like a gift whose value she had not fully understood until she needed it most. Outside, the valley was coming apart. On the first night, 3 cabins lost their roofs. The wind found the gaps where timber met. Timber worked its fingers into the joints, with the patience of something that has all the time in the world pride, and twisted until the shingles lifted and the rafters groaned, and the sky opened above families who had gone to sleep believing their homes would protect them. They fled through the storm to neighbors crowding into cabins already struggling to hold heat-burning furniture when the firewood ran low, burning anything that would catch: books, crates, chair legs, the wooden frames of things that had seemed permanent an hour ago. On the second day, the temperature dropped to 35 below zero, exposed skin frozen under 3 minutes. The snow accumulated at 4 inches every hour, driven into drifts that buried fences and blocked doors and covered windows until the cabins looked like white mounds, with thin threads of smoke rising from their chimneys, each thread growing thinner as the wood supplies ran toward their ends. In the cave, the thermometer held at 63 degrees. Clara fed the fire every 2 hours, precise and careful, rationing the wood she had stacked against exactly this kind of emergency. The heat wall did its work in the silence between feedings, releasing what it had stored with the steady patience of the earth itself, warming the air, without being asked, without requiring anything in return. On the second night, Franklin Holt's roof collapsed. The sound woke the family from fitful sleep, a crack like a rifle shot, followed by the long groan of timber giving way, followed by the crash that sounds like the end of certainty. Franklin stumbled from the bedroom and found half his living room open to the sky. Snow poured through the gap in a continuous curtain. The temperature dropped so fast he could feel it on his face like a hand pressing down. He tried to fix it. 4 hours he tried. Nailing canvas over the gap, piling furniture against the wind, working with hands that grew number by the minute, fighting a battle the way a man fights when he does not yet understand that the battle cannot be won by effort alone, that some things require a different approach entirely, and no amount of will can substitute for that. By midnight, ice was forming on the inside walls of the remaining rooms. By 2 in the morning, Edwin was shivering in a way that was no longer ordinary cold. His lips had turned a color that had no business on the face of a 13-year-old boy. His responses were slow, the particular slowness of a body beginning to redirect its resources toward the core away from the periphery, making the calculations that bodies make when the margin is narrowing. Franklin stood in the ruins of his house and experienced the thing that powerful men fear most. Not failure, not embarrassment, not the judgment of their peers. The thing they fear most is the moment of knowing with absolute certainty that they have been wrong about the thing they were most certain about, and that the cost of that wrongness is being paid by someone they love. He looked at Edwin, at the blue tinge at the lips, at the shallow breathing. He looked at the house he had built, The house he had told Clara Bergstrom was the right way to build, the only way to build the way that had always been done and would always be done because it was correct and she was a crazy Swedish widow who had lost her mind to grief. He thought about her words at the creek 2 months ago. My husband died 20 feet from our cabin door. He went out for firewood because the cabin had burned through everything we had. He understood now. Not with his mind had understood. It then had done the calculation and found it correct and then buried the result under everything that depended on the result being wrong. He understood it now, with his gut, with his bones, with the deep wordless part of him that registers truth when the body has nowhere left to hide from it. Get dressed, he said. All of you, we are leaving. Dorinda looked at him, not with surprise, with a kind of terrible clarity, the expression of a woman who has been waiting without knowing she was waiting for this particular moment to arrive. Where, she said. The word caught in his throat like broken glass. He swallowed it. The cave, he said. The walk should have taken 10 minutes. It took an hour. The snow was waist deep in places and chest deep in others, drifted into formations that had no relationship to the landscape that had existed 24 hours ago. The world had been redesigned by a force with no interest in human convenience. The wind hit them from every angle simultaneously, trying to knock them down, trying to separate them, trying to spin them around the way it had spun Henry Bergstrom around on a February night in Montana 3 years before. Franklin carried Edwin. The boy was dead weight now, 13 years old, and nearly as tall as his mother, his arms hanging with the particular heaviness of a body that is conserving everything it has left for the tasks that cannot be delegated. Franklin could feel the boy's heartbeat through all the layers of clothing. Slow, each beat a fraction longer after the last, like a clock that has been running a long time and is beginning to feel the distance it has traveled. Dorinda walked behind him, one hand gripping the back of his coat. Her grip was the grip of someone who understood that letting go meant being lost in the white in seconds. She had not spoken since they left the house. She had simply wrapped herself in everything she could find and followed. Because when your child is dying and someone is moving toward, help you follow. Even if you are not certain help exists. She fell twice. The first time her foot caught something buried under the snow, a fence post, a root, the edge of a world that no longer had edges, and she went down hard and the snow closed over her head like water closing over a stone. Franklin had to set Edwin down in the drift to pull her free. The 8 seconds it took were the longest 8 seconds of his life because Edwin was lying in 35 below zero with no one holding him, and every second was a second closer to the line from which you do not come back. The second time she fell, Franklin almost did not hear it happen. The wind swallowed the sound. He felt the tug on his coat disappear and turned to find nothing behind him but white. For 3 heartbeats, he stood in the howling dark. His dying son in his arms, his wife vanished, the world reduced to approximately 2 feet of visibility in every direction, and beyond that edge, nothing. Just the white and the cold, and the absolute indifference of a universe that did not care whether he lived or died. He shouted her name. The wind took it apart before it had traveled a yard. He shouted again and heard faintly from somewhere to his left a sound that might have been a voice. He moved toward it. His boots struck her body where she lay curled in the snow, and he set Edwin down again and pulled her up and put her hand back on his coat and said things he would not remember afterward. Words that were probably not words at all, but simply sounds, the sounds a man makes when he is holding everything together by refusing to stop moving. Halfway there, Franklin lost his direction. The world was white in every direction. No landmarks, no shadows, no difference between ground and sky. He stood in the howling dark and did not know if the next step would take him toward the cave or away from it deeper into the nothing. In that moment, he understood something he had not understood before. Not as information, but as experience felt in the body rather than processed by the mind. This is how Henry Bergstrom died. This exact white, this exact erasure. Not knowing which direction was home. Walking and walking without knowing if each step was saving you or killing you. 20 feet from warmth. 20 feet from his wife's voice. 20 feet from his son. Clara Bergstrom had not been building a cave because she was crazy. She had been building it because she had knelt in the spring mud and pried her dead husband's frozen fingers open one by one and understood something in that act of opening that Franklin was only now standing in the same white beginning to understand. He turned to left. He did not know why. Instinct or prayer or the simple mathematics of a man who has run out of every other option. He turned left and took 20 steps with his eyes closed against the wind and his arms full of his son, and his outstretched hand struck rock. The cliff face, the overhang, the stone. He moved along the rock with his hand on the wall until his fingers found wood. The door. He made a fist and pounded on it with everything he had left, which was not much, but was enough. "Please," he shouted into the wind. "Please, my son is dying, please." The door opened. Light came out first, the warm amber light of a fire that had been burning steadily for 2 days, without crisis, without drama, without consuming itself in a losing fight against the cold. Then the warmth came, not a thin, desperate warmth, not the warmth of a fireplace that is losing its war against 40 below, but real warmth, steady, deep, emanating from the walls themselves as much as from the fire. The warmth of stone that has been absorbing heat for 2 months and giving it back with the patience of the earth that backed it. Clara stood in the doorway. She looked at Franklin. At Edwin in his arms, the boy's face slack lips that color frost on his lashes. At Dorinda behind him, her face blank with the particular blankness of someone who has spent the last hour spending everything they had just to keep moving and has nothing left for expression. She looked at this man who had called her mad, who had spread rumors of witchcraft through a community that had been willing to believe them, who had threatened to kill her dog, who had done everything within his considerable power to ensure that she failed because her success threatened something he had built his entire identity upon. She looked at his son. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "All of you. Come in." By dawn of the third day, the cave held 14 people. After Franklin and his family came Harcourt Stratton, the engineer, whose professional pride had finally been broken by 3 nights of temperatures his theories could not explain away. He arrived with his wife, both of them carrying the hollow-eyed look of people who have not slept since the storm began. Then Owen Hadley and his daughter Nell Owen's face carrying the particular expression of a man who knows he should have stood up sooner and is grateful beyond words to be given shelter anyway. Nell pressed close to her father and looked at everything with the wide, careful eyes of a 16-year-old, taking the measure of a situation she will remember for the rest of her life. Then the Prescott family with their 8-month-old daughter, wrapped in so many blankets, she looked like a bundle of cloth, with a small red face peering out. Then the widow Harriet Bowen with her 2 young sons who had walked a mile through the storm because their cabin door had been torn from its frame by the wind and the cold had come in behind it like something that had been waiting for exactly that invitation. Then Reverend Aldous Crane, alone, his face carrying something heavier than cold. He stepped across the threshold and could not meet Clara's eyes. She did not make him. She simply moved aside and let him in, the same as she had let in everyone else, without condition, without ledger, without requiring anything from any of them, except that they come inside and let the warmth do what warmth does. 14 people in a space built for 3. Every one of them had mocked or doubted or feared or actively worked against the woman whose door now stood between them and the storm. Clara welcomed them all. She built the fire up carefully, adding the logs she had set aside for exactly this contingency, calculating the supply against the need with the quiet precision of someone who has been doing that kind of arithmetic for 2 days and knows the numbers by heart. She heated water. She made soup from her stores, stretching everything, knowing she was feeding mouths she had not planned to feed, knowing it did not matter. She organized the space with the efficiency of someone who understands that panic is the enemy of survival and order is its antidote. She placed the weakest closest to the fire. She arranged pallets from blankets and spare clothing. She gave instructions in a voice that did not invite discussion. "No one opens this door unless I say so. The fire gets fed every 2 hours. We have enough wood for 3 days if we are careful. Water gets boiled before anyone drinks it. The children stay near the hearth." No one argued. Not even Franklin Holt, who sat in the far corner as far from Clara as the small space allowed with Edwin, laid out near the fire and Dorinda beside the boy, her hand on his chest, feeling each breath like a promise being renewed. Scout moved among the 14 people with the calm purposefulness of an animal who has found his function and is carrying it out with complete commitment. He pressed his warm flank against whoever reached for him. He lay beside the children. He put his head in Dorinda Holt's lap at one point, and she put her hand on him without thinking, and some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders, and she breathed more slowly. Scout did not know that Franklin Holt had stood in the cold with a rifle and threatened to put him down. He knew only that Franklin Holt was cold and that cold people need warmth and that he had warmth to give. A dog's forgiveness is not complicated. It is not even really forgiveness in the human sense because it requires no decision and involves no struggle. It is simply the absence of the thing that would need to be forgiven, replaced by the thing that is actually needed. By the second hour, Edwin's breathing had deepened. By the fourth, color had begun to return to his face by degrees, slow, incremental, the body reclaiming itself from the edge it had been approaching. By dawn, he was awake, confused, weak, but awake and warm and alive. Dorinda pressed her face against her son's chest and wept in the way that people weep when the thing they feared most has not happened. Not quietly, not with composure, but with everything they have been holding back for the hours when composure was what survival required. The sound was raw and private and completely unguarded, and everyone in the cave looked away, giving her the only privacy available in a space where 15 bodies shared the same air. On the second night, the Prescott baby's fever spiked. Clara heard the change in the infant's cry around midnight, a higher pitch, a particular register of distress that mothers recognize, the way musicians recognize a note that is wrong. She went to check and found the baby burning its tiny body, rigid, its breathing rapid and shallow. Mrs. Prescott was barely conscious herself, hollowed out by days of inadequate food and the terror of the journey through the storm. Clara took charge without announcement or explanation. She heated water and cooled it to lukewarm. She soaked cloths and laid them against the baby's forehead, its chest, its legs. She worked with the focused calm of someone who has learned that in a crisis, composure is not a luxury, but the most practical tool available. She worked through the night, changing the cloths as they warmed, fighting the fever 1 degree at a time, the way you fight any enemy that is larger than you, not with one grand gesture, but with 1,000 small, impatient ones, each one insufficient by itself, but collectively more than enough. Eli woke at some point and watched his mother work. He did not ask if he could help. He simply rose from his pallet and began heating more water, preparing more cloths, moving quietly around the sleeping bodies, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been paying attention for a long time and knows what is needed. Nell Hadley joined them. 16 years old, her hands steady her presence, adding to the calm rather than disturbing it. The daughter of a carpenter who had raised her to understand that the best way to help is to simply begin. Then Eli did something that stopped Clara mid-motion, that made her look up and hold very still for a moment before she could trust herself to keep working. He began to talk to the baby, softly, almost in a whisper, kneeling beside the small, flushed face. He told the baby about Scout, about how Scout had appointed himself supervisor of the cave construction and lay at the entrance every day to make sure no one did anything wrong. He told the baby about the stones that rang clear when you struck them and what that ringing meant, and how you could tell the good ones from the ones that would fail when the cold came. He told the baby about the walls, about how the stone remembered the warmth of every sunny day that had ever touched it, and how that warmth was here right now in this room, in these walls, and the baby was inside it and was safe. His voice was gentle and even. The voice of a boy who knew what it meant to be small and frightened and to need someone calm beside you in the dark. Who knew, because he had been that small, frightened thing, and someone had been calm beside him, and it had made the difference between surviving and not. He was doing for this infant what Peter Voss had done for him 2 months ago, passing forward the kindness that had been passed to him, the circle closing in a way that no one had planned, but that felt in the warm cave while the blizzard tore the world apart outside like the most natural thing. By dawn, the fever broke. The baby slept, breathing even. Color returned. Mrs. Prescott woke to find her daughter alive and looked at Clara with eyes that had nothing left in them for composure or restraint. "You saved her," she said. "We were going to stay in our cabin. We believed what people said about you. We believed it, and we almost." Clara knelt beside her. "Your baby is alive. That is what matters now." On the morning of the third day, the storm exhaled its last breath and went still. Clara opened the door for the first time in 72 hours. The world outside was white and silent and utterly transformed. Snow lay 4 feet deep across the valley, drifted to 10 feet or more against buildings and rock faces. The silence was absolute, the silence that follows destruction when the instrument of it has spent itself entirely, and the world is too stunned to make a sound. The 14 people emerged one by one, blinking in the weak December light, standing in the white stillness, and trying to find the valley they remembered beneath what the storm had left behind. The count came in slowly over the following hours as men dug paths between structures and called out names and waited for answers. Two did not answer. Augustine Weld was found in his cabin in his armchair, a blanket pulled around his shoulders, his large blacksmith's hands resting on the arms of the chair in the posture of a man who had sat down to rest. His fire had gone out sometime during the first night, and his hands, which had swung a hammer for 12 hours at a stretch for 50 years, which had shaped iron and bent steel and built things that lasted, had not been able to grip the matches when the cold came. On the table beside him, an open Bible turned to the 23rd Psalm. In his lap, the rope he had been mending, roughly 2/3 complete, the fibers still holding the shape of his fingers. Silas Pruitt was the one who found him. The old miner had been awake before the wind dropped enough to walk lying in Corbin's spare room with the specific wakefulness of a man whose body will not allow the comfort of sleep when someone he cares for might be in danger. He set out as soon as it was possible to move, pushing through the snow, with his cane slow and absolutely determined, the way men who have spent their lives underground learn to move through resistance. He stood in the doorway of his friend's cabin for a long time. Augustine looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had sat down in his chair to rest and made his own kind of decision. Not surrender, maybe just acceptance. The quiet acceptance of a man who had lived fully and was not afraid of what came next, who had looked at the matches on the mantel and the empty wood box and the photograph of his wife and son on the mantel above the cold fireplace, and decided that what was waiting for him on the other side of this cold was better than one more fight he was too tired to win. Silas stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. He sat in the chair opposite his friend and stayed there for 10 minutes, not praying, not weeping, just being present, the way men of that generation showed respect for the dead, not with flowers or words, but with the simple refusal to leave quickly, to treat the passing as something to be efficiently processed and moved on from. Then he stood. He picked up the unfinished rope from Augustine's lap. He coiled it carefully with the respect you give to something that belonged to someone you valued. He put it in his coat pocket. He would carry it there for the rest of his life. He would never finish it. Some things are not meant to be completed by other hands. The second death was the Pruitt baby. She had not survived the first night of the storm. They found her in her cradle, still and cold, wrapped in every blanket her mother had been able to pile around her blankets, that were not enough, that could never be enough, because blankets are not enough when the house itself has surrendered to the cold. Corbin Pruitt stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with a face that was no longer a face. It was a surface gray and emptied from which everything had been removed. Ruth had not left their cabin. She sat beside the empty cradle and stared at a wall gone somewhere inside herself, where the world could not follow, and where grief was so large it had consumed the capacity for any other expression. Corbin had not refused Clara because he was cruel. He had refused because he was afraid, afraid of being mocked, afraid of being different, afraid of choosing the woman the settlement called a witch over the men whose approval he had been trying to earn since the day he arrived. He had chosen the safe path, the popular path, the path that every neighbor endorsed, and his daughter had died on that path. He would carry that knowledge for every remaining day of his life. Silas stood beside his grandson. He placed his old trembling hand on Corbin's shoulder and kept it there. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Two men, a grandfather and a father, sharing a grief that had no bottom and no edges, standing in the snow while the valley counted what it had lost. Franklin Holt walked toward Clara. The gathered crowd watched. Some of them held their breath without knowing they were doing it the way people hold their breath when something is happening that they cannot predict and cannot stop and cannot look away from. He stopped 3 feet from her and met her eyes. His face was not the face he had arrived in Ridgecrest Valley with. That face had been the face of certainty of a man who knew what he knew and built what he built and did not question the foundation under his feet. This face was something else, something that had been through a press and come out thinner and more honest. I was wrong. His voice cracked on the second word and did not recover. He turned to the people watching. I told you she was crazy. I told you her methods would fail. I told you she was... He stopped. He turned back to Clara, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, but in the silence of the snow-covered valley, every word carried exactly as far as it needed to. And when my son was dying and my house was falling and everything I built proved worthless against one night of cold, she opened her door. She saved my family. She saved all of us who were too proud or too afraid to listen to her when it would have cost us less. He was crying. This man who had ridden through the valley on a fine bay horse with the bearing of someone who owned everything worth owning, standing in the snow with tears freezing on his cheeks in the bitter air. There is more I need to say, more I need to confess. The crowd went very still. I spread those rumors, not because I believed them, I never believed them. I spread them because she threatened my business. Because there is limestone under her land worth real money, and I wanted to drive her out and buy it cheap. I told Owen Hadley not to do business with her. I did everything I could to destroy a widow and her son because she made me afraid that I had been wrong, and I could not live with being wrong. He looked at the snow mound that marked the Pruitt cabin. When people died in those cabins, instead of coming to her for help, that was partly because of what I planted in this community. I know that. I will carry that. He knelt in the snow. The cold soaked through his trousers immediately, but he did not seem to notice or care. He had gone somewhere past the place where physical discomfort registers as a priority. I am sorry, he said. I know it is not enough. Nothing I say makes what happened unhappen. But I am sorry. Virgil Moss stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He was 22 years old and looked considerably younger in that moment, his face red, his voice unsteady, his youth suddenly very visible. I bet money she would fail by Christmas. I made jokes. I helped spread the stories. He pressed 2 worn bills into Clara's hand. For your teaching fund, he said. For whatever helps other people avoid being the fool I was. Others came forward. Coins, small bills. Whatever they had in their pockets offered without ceremony, without requiring anything in acknowledgement. Reverend Aldous Crane stepped forward last. He had the look of a man who has been rehearsing something for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment when the rehearsal ends and the real thing begins and is discovering that the real thing is harder than any rehearsal prepared him for. I preached against you, he said. I stood in front of this community and I used the authority of my position to make people afraid of you. I knew what I was doing. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway because I owed Franklin Holt money, and I told myself that justified it. He stopped, started again. When the storm came, you did not turn me away, even after everything I did. And I have been sitting with that for 3 days, and I do not know what to do with it, except to stand here and say that I was wrong, and you were right, and I am sorry, and I will spend the rest of my ministry trying to be worthy of the grace you showed me. Clara looked at all of them, at Franklin, still on his knees in the snow, at Virgil with his young face, at Reverend Crane with his shaking hands, at Harcourt Stratton, standing quietly to one side, at Owen Hadley, who had left hinges on a stone rather than nothing, at Silas Pruitt with the outline of a coiled rope in his coat pocket, at Corbin standing apart with the face of a man trying to figure out how to keep breathing. She thought about Henry walking in the wrong direction in the snow. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the mortar ratio, 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water, and how the chain of that knowledge had passed from Dalarna to Montana to this cave in Colorado without breaking, despite everything that had tried to break it. She thought about Eli, who was standing behind her watching everything, learning what kind of person his mother chose to be when she had every right to choose otherwise. Get up, she said to Franklin quietly. Not with warmth, she was not there yet, and she was not going to pretend, but without coldness either. The voice you use was someone who is in pain and does not need an audience for it. He looked up at her. Get up, she said again, and come help me dig out the living. There will be time for everything else later. Right now, people need us. She held out her hand, the same hand that had mixed mortar and laid stone, the same hand that had pried open her dead husband's frozen fingers in the spring mud, the same hand that had opened a door in the middle of the worst blizzard in 40 years for 14 people who had given her nothing and taken everything they could. Franklin looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. She pulled him to his feet, and they went to work. 3 weeks after the storm, Corbin Pruitt came to the cave alone. He stood at the entrance for a long time before he could make himself speak. When he finally did, his voice was the voice of a man who has been hollowed out by grief and is trying to fill the empty space with something that gives the loss meaning, because the alternative, carrying a loss that means nothing, is not something the human spirit can sustain indefinitely. Teach me, he said. Teach me how to build the way you do, so that no other father has to lose his child because he was too afraid to listen. Clara taught him. She taught him without judgment and without recrimination and without ever once referencing the choice he had made or the price he had paid. That was not magnanimity. That was simply practicality. She had learned from her father that you do not punish someone who comes to learn. You teach them because the learning itself is hard enough without adding shame to the weight of it. Corbin came every day for 3 weeks. He arrived before dawn and stayed until his hands were too stiff to work. He mixed mortar and carried stones and listened when Clara explained the principles, and sometimes she would look at his face and see something working behind his eyes, something building itself slowly from the rubble of what the storm had taken. He was rebuilding himself the same way she was teaching him to rebuild a structure from the foundation, one piece at a time, with patience and with the understanding that some things cannot be rushed and that rushing them only creates weaknesses that will show themselves later when the next storm comes. Ruth came once. She stood at the edge of the work site for nearly an hour, watching her husband learn to lay stone. She did not speak to Clara. She did not need to. Her presence was the communication. A woman who had lost her daughter standing in the place that might have saved her, watching her husband learn the lesson that had come too late. After that hour, she went home and did not come back. But Corbin told Clara that Ruth had started eating again, that she had spoken his name for the first time since the storm, that she had said her voice very quiet, learned everything she knows. Spring came slowly to Ridgecrest Valley. The snow retreated up the mountainsides inch by reluctant inch, as though the winter were not entirely convinced it was finished. The creek ran high and fast with meltwater cold and clear. The first green pushed through the mud in the tentative way that new things test the world before committing to it. And everywhere people were building, not just cabins, earth-sheltered homes, modified structures with thick clay walls and stone foundations, chimneys built to Clara's specifications, additions dug back into hillsides. The old ways spreading through the valley, the way spring itself spreads, warming things that had been frozen for a long time, not all at once, but steadily, with the patience of something that knows it will eventually reach everything. Clara taught every Saturday morning, standing in front of groups of men and women who had called her crazy and now brought notebooks in questions, in the particular humility that comes from nearly dying because you trusted the wrong authority. She explained the principles the way her father had explained them to her, patiently, completely, without condescension, because knowledge has no value if it is not shared. Owen Hadley attended every session, his carpenter's eye finding ways to combine her stone and earth methods with his woodworking skills, building something stronger than either tradition alone. He never mentioned the hinges. He did not need to. They both knew. Harcourt Stratton came with a notebook in his engineering vocabulary, and what he found there was that the vocabulary was not wrong. It simply had not previously been applied to things old enough to have proven themselves. He began writing letters to colleagues in Philadelphia. He used terms they would not fully understand for another 50 years, but he used them correctly, and the letters went out, and some of them were kept, and some of what was kept was eventually read by people who needed to read it. Franklin Holt was Clara's most dedicated student. He arrived early and stayed late and asked questions until he understood not just the technique, but the principle beneath it, not just the recipe, but the reason. He worked alongside everyone else with none of his former authority, his expensive clothes replaced by practical work, wear stained with clay, and effort, his certainty, replaced by something that was not certainty, but was perhaps more useful. A willingness to learn, a willingness to be wrong and to keep going anyway. One evening after they had finished building a root cellar for the Prescott family, Franklin approached Clara. The others had gone home. The spring evening was long and still and warm enough to stand outside without a coat for the first time since October. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "Why did you let us in that night? You could have refused. You had every reason to refuse." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, still faintly stained with the day's clay. "My father used to say that knowledge has no value if it is not shared. That wisdom kept to yourself might as well not exist." She looked at him steadily. "But there is something else. Something I learned the morning I found my husband in the snow. Hatred is heavy. She touched her chest over the chain that still held Henry's ring against her skin. Carrying it takes the same energy you need for everything else. I could have spent my strength hating you, on anger, on making you answer for what you did. But then I would have had nothing left for building, for teaching, for keeping my son safe. She looked at the wall they had spent the afternoon, finishing, her hand resting on the smooth stone. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to someone else, she said. It is a weight you set down for yourself. Franklin was quiet for a long time. I do not deserve it, he said. No, Clara agreed, but that is not really the point, is it? In late summer, a letter arrived from California in Astrid Voss's careful handwriting. Her brother's ranch. 50 families of workers who needed homes that would not kill them. $200 a year, room and board included. Come teach what you know to people who need to learn it. Eli found Clara reading the letter by the fire that evening. He read it himself slowly, then looked at her with his serious eyes. Do you want to go? I do not know. There is so much work still to do here. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then there are people who need teaching in California too. And it would be warm. Scout would not have to be cold anymore. At the sound of his name, Scout lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor. The universal signal for, I heard my name and I approve of whatever is being discussed. What do you think we should do? Clara asked. Samuel considered the question with a gravity that made him seem older than 11. He looked around the cave at the walls that had held through the worst storm in 40 years, at the door that had opened for enemies, at the fireplace that had warmed 14 people when the world outside was trying to kill them all. I think we should stay until everyone here knows what you know, he said, until they do not need you to tell them anymore. Then we should go. He paused. But we should come back every few years to make sure they remember. Clara pulled him close and held him, and felt the thin shoulders that were not quite as thin as they had been a year ago, felt the heartbeat of a boy who had seen too much, and somehow come through it with his capacity for tenderness and tact, which was its own kind of miracle. When did you get so wise? She said into his hair. He shrugged against her. I learned from watching you. The following autumn, Clara Bergstrom and her son Eli left Ridgecrest Valley. The whole settlement came to see them off. The aspens were turning gold again, as they had been turning when Clara arrived a year ago, the circle of a season closing around everything that had changed. May the mule stood patient in the traces. The wagon was loaded with everything Clara owned, which was not much more than she had arrived with, except that $52 had become something that cannot be measured in currency. It had become a community that knew how to survive. Owen Hadley shook her hand and held on a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and when he let go, his eyes were bright in the way that certain men's eyes get bright when they are feeling something too large for the words available to them. He cleared his throat and looked away. Nell took his arm. Harcourt Stratton brought a leather-bound notebook containing every measurement in ratio and calculation from the Saturday morning sessions. For your students in California, he said. So they know this is not just tradition, it is science. Theodora Finch did not say goodbye. She pressed a jar of preserved plums into Clara's hands and looked at her with the dry, bright eyes of a woman who has outlived too many things to be sentimental about departure. You remember the lard and the plaster, she said. Clara smiled. I remember. Silas Pruitt leaned on his cane and nodded once, the nod of one survivor to another, carrying in it everything that needed saying. Franklin Holt stood at the head of the trail with his hat in his hands. He had aged in the past year, but the aging had improved him the way weather improves stone wearing away. What was soft and uncertain, leaving only what was solid. He was not the man who had ridden through the valley on a fine bay horse with the bearing of someone who owned the world. He was something better and harder and more honest. You saved my family, he said. You saved me, not just from the cold. You showed me it was not too late to change, that a man could be better than the worst thing he had done. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand, for the journey and for whatever comes after. She counted it later. $50, more than he could easily spare. Exactly the right amount because it cost him something. Gifts that cost nothing mean nothing. Clara climbed to the wagon seat. Eli sat beside her. Scout arranged himself between them with the dignified composure of a dog who has decided his place in the world and sees no reason to renegotiate it. She took up the reins. She looked at the valley one last time at the hillside with its cave at the settlement that had called her crazy, and then come to her door in the dark at the aspens turning gold in the thin Colorado light, at the faces of people she had arrived among as a stranger and was leaving as something harder to name. Then she turned May south and they moved out of the valley and the aspens closed behind them, and Ridgecrest Valley settled into the quiet work of remembering. Clara Bergstrom died in 1895 at the age of 58 in the California home she had built into a hillside south of Sacramento. She was surrounded by Eli and his wife, their two children, and Astrid Voss, who had become her closest friend in the way that people become close friends when they have recognized each other through the work of their hands and the losses they have carried and the doors they have chosen to open. Her last words were for Eli. "Tell them," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, the way a voice gets when it has one more important thing to say and intends to say it well. "Tell them that stone remembers warmth, and that people remember too. They remember who helped them when they needed it most. They remember who opened the door." He promised. He kept that promise for the rest of his life. Eli Bergstrom became an engineer in San Francisco. He built more than 200 earth-sheltered structures in California, Colorado, and Oregon. He trained 47 apprentices, each of whom built structures of their own. He never forgot the mortar ratio: 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water, and he taught it to every apprentice on the first day of their training, making them repeat it until they could say it in their sleep, the way his mother had taught him, the way her father had taught her, the chain, unbroken across the generations and across the ocean. On the wall of his office, he kept 2 things: a photograph of his mother standing at the entrance to the cave in 1885, her hand pressed flat against the limestone, her face turned toward the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but held more warmth than most smiles contain. And beside it, a small framed piece of paper on which he had written in his own hand the words his grandfather Eric had spoken to a girl in Sweden half a century before. "Stone holds warmth like a living thing." He told every visitor who asked about it the same thing. My mother proved that was true, not just about stone, about all of us. In 2018, the Historical Society of Colorado placed a bronze marker at the entrance to a cave in what had once been called Ridgecrest Valley. The inscription reads, "Here in 1871, Clara Bergstrom built a home into the mountain when others said it could not be done. During the Christmas blizzard of that year, her earth-sheltered dwelling saved 14 lives. Her methods anticipated the principles of modern passive house design by more than a century. She proved that traditional knowledge applied with skill and determination can outlast the conventional wisdom of its time. She also proved something more important, that forgiveness is stronger than revenge, that teaching is more lasting than triumph, that the door we open to our enemies can become the door through which we all walk towards something better." Her father once told her that stone remembers warmth like a living thing. Clara Bergstrom proved that people remember too. The warmth they remember best is the warmth of being helped when they needed it most, being forgiven when they did not deserve it, being taught when they were finally ready to learn. That is her legacy, not a cave in a mountainside, a truth carved into the hearts of everyone her life touched.